on this computer. Hi, welcome to another of my writers' recommends from the book room. I'm really delighted today to have Marianne Levy. We just had this conversation. Marianne Levy with me. Hi, Marianne.
Hello.
We just had a conversation about, is it Levy or is it Levy? And because Deborah Levy is my favourite, so I always say Levy. But then Marianne was telling me that one of the writers that she's picked has a surname and it's pronounced Levy. So anyway, that's why I got confused. So just to recap for those who may be joining for the first time, the premise of the book room is that I have asked writers who I love their work and I admire their work to come and put together curations. Oh, I don't know where Marianne's gone.
Oh, I'm still here. Hello. Don't know what happened there.
Put together curations of their favorite books within their genre and within the genres that they write in. So they're the books that they press into people's hands. They're the books that they go back to in their own work. They're contemporary finds or they're classic finds, but they're just a bunch of 4 really fascinating books. So Marianne has a book called Don't Forget to Scream. Unspoken truths about motherhood. I had to have a look there because it's a mirror image on there. It's a little early in the morning for my brain to unravel that one. I mean, I love this cover, but actually this isn't your first book because you usually write for children, right?
So I've written 5 books for children. I've written 3 sort of, I suppose I'd call them middle grade books for 7 to 10-year-olds, I would say. And then I've written 2 books that I think come under the heading clean teen. So they're sort of the young tweens and teenagers.
Okay, like the innocent ones.
Yeah,
I wouldn't know. I
absolutely.
don't have one of those tweens, but I see some around.
But yeah, so this was my first book for, I shouldn't say grown-ups, for adults. This is my first book for adults.
Okay,
yeah.
lovely. And I mean, before we talk about this, so Marianne's put together a curation on motherhood, so her favorite books on motherhood, and I'm just looking at them all here in a pile, and they just look gorgeous, and so I'm super excited for her to talk us through them. But first we'll just have a chat about this because
Yes.
this book in the shop has been very popular.
Oh, really?
Yes, and so many people gravitate towards it. I think it's got a great cover, and then they open it and they see this picture on the inside and they're like, okay, yeah, that just about sums motherhood up. And I'm like, yeah, it's perfect depiction of motherhood, that kind of strained smile and bulging eyes that we all recognize or remember.
That was one of the first designs actually for the cover, was a version of that,
Really?
an even scarier version of that. But actually then we saw the cover mock-up, we went, and that's just terrifying.
Oh, really?
So a sort of slightly toned down version of it. You imagine that woman sort of blown up with a sort of huge angry bulgy eye.
No.
So we shrunk her down a bit and we put her in the end papers instead.
I think you did the right thing. We want to gravitate towards books that we can empathize with, but like not too much like our real life from the cover. So could you tell us a little bit about this book, about its creation, about the writing of it? Just tell us about it.
Yes, of course. So it was a book that I never intended to write. Well, I mean, obviously I intended to write it at the point where I was writing it, but originally I was a children's writer, and I hadn't ever particularly thought, I always enjoyed reading literary nonfiction, I suppose, which is what this would come under, and narrative nonfiction. But I'd never particularly written any, done the odd bit of journalism. And then I'd had a terrible time after the birth of my daughter, not because my story of sort of having her or her early months and years were particularly unusual, but I felt like I couldn't communicate them to anybody. I felt that I'd been sort of blown apart, and that it had been this incredible, all-consuming experience. And yet to the world around me, it seemed completely uninteresting to everybody. It seemed completely normal and everyday and humdrum. And, you know, I'd start telling people about it, and then they'd change the subject, or they find it uncomfortable, or they would just assume that because I looked okay and I had this sort of sweet, snuffly, smiley baby, that I was a kind of the sort of, you know, the kind of icons of motherhood, the kind of smiling John Lewis adverty, Marks and Spencer's-y, Gaia, Virgin Mary kind of mashup. And in reality,
I mean, that's a lot of pressure, isn't it?
Yeah, and it was, and I felt, you know, I'm a perfectionist. I work hard, and I played up to that. And what I found was that when I tried to talk to people about the realities of what I was going through, right from the moment when I walked through the front door with my newborn, I was silenced. I was told, oh, well, it must be worth it, or isn't your baby lovely, but you're doing so well. And after a time, I found myself silencing myself. I found that I found that I lacked the language to talk about this incredible human experience. And this went on for months and weeks and years. And then I had my son 4 years later, and he was very ill in the first few days of his life. And then I was very ill. I had some post-operative infections, so I had a C-section, and he was in neonatal intensive care. And for whatever reason, I couldn't keep up that kind of smiley silence that I had before. And I still couldn't talk to people about it. I still couldn't seem to convey within the bounds of acceptable conversation what had been happening to me. But when he was 2 weeks old, I wrote, it was very short. It was something like 800 words. And I put them on Medium, and I just published them, put them on Twitter, as much to just explain to people how I was as anything else. It wasn't to a particular end, but I thought, when people are saying, how are you? This is how I am. And on paper, I wasn't silenced. I could keep talking. And it went huge. It absolutely exploded. And people messaged me saying, oh my goodness, 20, 30, 40 years ago, I was brought back to my first days of motherhood. And so I carried on. I just wrote the occasional piece, just trying to articulate how I was feeling and the things that I was wrestling with, and to try to be truthful, to try to pin my feelings to the page. And then the pandemic happened. And quite early on in the pandemic, I had an approach from my favorite editor, an amazing editor. She's called Francesca Main, and she edited people like Adam Kay, This Is Going to Hurt, Jessie Burton, The Miniaturist, you know, this incredible editor, who said, would you ever consider making this into a book? And I didn't reply for a month because I was terrified, and I hadn't thought about doing it, and I was afraid to do it, and I didn't know if I wanted to do it. And then eventually I got back to her, and then eventually, you know, this happened. But it was a long and slightly unexpected process, and it wasn't a book that I began by intending to write.
I think in some ways, I mean, I write narrative nonfiction as a ghostwriter in my sort of day job, and I think in some ways that's the best way for these books to come to fruition.
Yeah, I'm just shutting the door because my husband has just appeared in the background.
Well, he's welcome to join in. I'm sure he has a story to tell about this. Yeah, I think that in some ways, when they arrive on the page in that more organic way, rather than a forced way of sitting down and, you know, writing a proposal and the structure, and I know you had to do all of that, when it's comes just you know, just so organically, I think that that's the best way, because I think it keeps the air in the balloon and the energy in the writing.
Yeah.
And it just feels really honest. And I think that's the thing that everybody says about this book. I'll just give it another flash because it's so everybody says it's a very, very honest account. And it was interesting because when I was reading it, I was thinking about when my daughter's 10 now, and I, you know, lots of, you know, everything that you've written really resonated with me. And I remember I wrote a piece for Grazia about how I'd rather go to work than stay at home with my kid. And that was say 9 years ago, and it felt like the worst thing you could say then. And I remember going to pick her up from her first day at nursery, and they said, oh, how was your day? And I went, wonderful. And all these parents looked at me like, you're not meant to say that. you're meant to be like sobbing and, you know, being so happy to be reunited.
Yeah.
And me and my daughter sort of looked at each other like, oh God, you, oh God, I thought I'd escaped you, you know. And that's not to say that that doesn't mean that you love them any less. It just means that you don't stop being you when you push that baby out, or
No.
have that baby, you know, taken out with the help of doctors. And I think that's why your book resonates so much with people.
Well, thank you. I absolutely have that sense that you have as well. And I do think, and it's one of the later chapters, that we have been raised and educated to go out into the world and to do stuff and see people
Mm,
beyond motherhood's sphere. We were, told all the way through our childhoods and our teenage years, our 20s, you can have it all, you can do
mm,
everything. And it's quite hard then, I think, to go, well, hang on, I've been told my whole life that the most important thing is to be educated and to go out into the world and use my intellect and be a force for doing whatever it is that I do. And also the most important thing is to be a mother. And
mm,
of course, when you've got those two forces
mm,
colliding, these sort of
mm,
big societal messages, and they collide internally,
mm.
I feel like I'm being torn in two a lot of the time. I feel it very, very hard,
Yeah.
and I don't feel that the men I know struggle with this. I don't understand. Well, I can make some guesses, but I don't feel like they've got those two conflicting messages at quite the same volume that
No.
we have
How,
them
how
playing outside and inside.
out of interest, how old were you when you had your daughter?
I was 30. Let me think. I was 35 when I had her, because I remember
Yeah,
being a
so
geriatric mother, in
yeah, so
inverted commas.
I was 35 when I had my
Yeah.
daughter. And I think that's
Oh,
oh,
my
you've
video's
disappeared
gone off.
again.
Sorry. I don't know why it's doing that. There we go.
People keep
Sorry
giving
about
me a hard
that.
time. Yeah, and I think that it's really difficult to have, you know, been that career woman and to have built that life and curated that life and the social life and the work life and everything. And then literally it stops. I mean, I was
Yeah.
also on my own as a single, you know, when my baby was born. And so I had to do all that alone as well. But I think I don't know if there's any difference between having a baby at 25 that people perhaps used to do, and then, you know, but like you said, we're told to go out in the world, we can do this, we can have the career, we can, and then at 35, for everything to, like, these shutters just come down on everything you've
Yeah.
built up. It's a
And
grief.
and to have to then hide it. That, I think that's the thing that I
Yeah.
found that I found very hard, is that a lot of my friends hadn't had children, and a lot of my work colleagues, we didn't ever talk about having had our children. And I always felt as though it was almost a weakness to talk
Mm,
about the realities of my life, that people wouldn't be that interested, that it was this
mm,
sort of a kind of personal sloppiness almost. And
mm,
I don't think that now.
mm,
But I thought it at the time, that I had to kind of hide it and put it into a compartment so that I could be this professional woman. And of course, that's terribly hard. I wrote a book while I was on maternity leave, and, then had to promote it when my daughter was very small. And I just didn't talk about that other side of my life.
mm.
And it was so hard. It was so hard. And I was hiding it so much. My husband was unaware of the
Yeah.
realities of what I
Wow.
was going through. And it makes me very angry now to think that, in a sense, I colluded with that. But
Right.
then, since I've, had the book out, so many people have spoken to me, so many people have spoken to my husband and said, thank God, finally we're talking about this. And
Mm.
I feel sad in a way that it took confessing in a book, and I talk about how hard it is, but also how joyful it is.
Yeah.
And I don't talk
Cool.
about that either in my life. You
Right.
don't, it feels icky to talk about it. And
It's also, you feel like
makes me so
preface
sad.
you have to preface all these hard bits with, yeah, but I wouldn't be without her, or I wouldn't be without him.
Yeah.
And I, you know, I mean, that should be just taken as a given, really, shouldn't it? You
Yeah.
don't need to sort of quickly shove that into a paragraph or something.
Yeah.
But the other thing I was thinking as well is that it's only when you start digging that you realize that, yes, it's true that of our generation, you know, these are, you know, your book, and some other more, you know, contemporary books that have come just before you know, have been talking about this, but then when you dig, you realize that there were women writers talking about this. I mean, I think about Penelope Mortimer, you know, writing in the 60s about, you know, in the Pumpkin Eater, but I was wondering if that brings us nicely into some of your picks.
Absolutely.
Because what I love about the curations that the writers do for me is that some are super contemporary and some are, you know, classics. And some of your books, I mean, you know, so, like I said, some are contemporary and some have been out for 20 years almost.
Yeah.
So maybe you'd like to tell us about why you picked them.
So I've got, shall I do a quick overview of all four
Why
of
don't you
them?
just go through them one at a time and
Okay, yeah,
flash
that's
them up?
fine.
I've got them here as well, so we could both flash them up.
Well, I want to start, in fact, what shall I start with? I'm wondering whether to start with Adrift or the Rachel Cusk. Can I start with Adrift, actually?
Yeah.
So I wanted to start, so Adrift, this is a proof, so this isn't actually quite what it looks like. This is Adrift by, brilliant, you've got it.
Yeah,
Adrift by Miranda Ward. And I wanted to talk about this because it is in fact a book about infertility. Miranda is trying all the way through the book to have a baby. And in fact, I'm going to read you the little blurb on the back because I think it sums it up better than I can. The world is not neatly divided into two camps of women, those who wanted to reproduce and did, and those who didn't want to and didn't. So many of us are caught here in between, neither one thing nor the other, drifting towards a receding horizon in our own camp.
Mm-hmm.
And before I hit my 30s, I just didn't think much about this stuff. I sort of thought, well, at some point my contemporaries will all just have a baby and then we'll be mothers and it will all be fine. I just didn't see any of this stuff. And Miranda writes so beautifully about the world of the in-between, of making the decision to have a baby and then all the stuff that comes with it as you wait. And what I love about this book is it ends as she's waiting. I think I've got this right. I think it ends as she's waiting for the results of some IVF.
Mm-hmm.
So you never know whether she has a baby or not.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one thing that happens in motherhood and in infertility is that people tend to go, well, whatever happened at the end is the important thing.
Yeah.
So, you know, when you're and it's not dissimilar when you've got a newborn. People say, well, look, it's not forever. This too shall pass one day. And you think, well, yes, but what you're saying is that the experience that I'm undergoing right now doesn't count, that I'm not feeling it, that it doesn't matter, because whatever happens in 6 months, in 6 years' time, somehow will erase it and erase its importance. And what Miranda Ward is saying is that no, the months and the years that she was, you know, had these fertility struggles, waiting, doubting, despairing, hoping, it says on the front, field notes from almost motherhood, they are important and they need to be talked about and they are valid. And she struggles with tremendous feelings, huge, all-encompassing feelings, and yet has to go about her life going to the picnics, holding other people's newborns, going into work, you know, secretly injecting herself, whatever. And it's awful and it's not fair. And it made me so sad and it made me so angry and it made me want to hold her. And it made me realize I'm surrounded by these women and they're not speaking. And so what I love about this book is it says this experience, her experience of infertility, of struggling to conceive, is valid and huge and big and important, and therefore I love this book. Absolutely love it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it sounds wonderful, and I know that women have come into the shop and they've been drawn to this. And you know, one woman, she came in with her 6-year-old and said, "Oh, there wasn't anything like this around when I was having IVF." And it's like you said, it's all these huge feelings that are going around and nothing to contain them, and you just, and this kind of not a dirty secret. I mean, I'm not suggesting it is, but that's how somebody might feel. And then who do they talk to, and who can they open up to? And actually, there might be other women wandering around. Well, there are with the same experiences, but you can't, talk to them. So a book like this, I imagine, contains all of that.
Yes, absolutely. And also, I suppose the thing that I found really valid, the thing that I more than valid, the thing that made me really want to read it is that I feel that a lot of these things, early motherhood, infertility, we're encouraged to speak to people with the same experiences. You find your community, you find your tribe. But I think one of the things that I found and sort of continue to find quite difficult is that I think that is really amazing and it's really helpful, but it still keeps it in its corner. It doesn't allow it into the kind of wider societal conversation. And actually, it should be, this kind of thing affects everybody, if not directly, then very indirectly. And that actually we all need to be talking about this, so that it shouldn't come as a surprise and a shock when someone close to you. I feel like grief is the example, and falling in love. They occupy a general space. They're not niche topics in the back corner, as it were. Whereas I feel like infertility, early motherhood, stillbirth, which we're going to come to, all of these things, that they're seen as quite niche. And actually, we all came out of somebody. This does affect all of us, and I hope that these books kind of bring all of these huge topics into the general conversation. That's certainly my hope for my book, which is why when you refer to the cover, we were very we didn't want it to skew too female, as it were. We wanted it to be appealing to everybody. We really shied away from putting a baby on the front or making it pink or a buggy and an upturned wine glass or whatever. We wanted to try and find a new direction to signal this is for everybody.
Okay, lovely. So that's Adrift by Miranda Ward. Tell us, what's your next pick?
And my next pick is The Rules Do Not Apply by Marianne Levy. I think if you've got a slightly different edition. Yes, you've got the paperback edition. Not coming out very well. There we go. The Rules Do Not Apply by Marianne Levy is an astonishing book. So Marianne Levy is a writer for The New Yorker. She's a staff writer. And a few years ago, a good few years ago now, she wrote a personal essay, which she didn't normally do, I think, and it was called Thanksgiving in Mongolia. And in it, she detailed how she went to Mongolia 5 months pregnant, on a sort of journalistic, she was to interview someone or something. And while she was there, she had a stillbirth in a hotel room. It turned out her placenta had come away. And she's in a hotel room on her own having a stillbirth. And then after that, her marriage implodes. She finds out that her wife is an alcoholic, and then sort of about what happens next. So it's about that. So the essay was just about the stillbirth, and it went huge again on the internet. People had never read writing like this about something like this, and it's raw and it's beautiful, and oh my God, I read it and I absolutely weep. And then she wrote this memoir, and it is about her decision to have a baby, about her relationship with her wife. And as I say, yes, then her marriage sort of breaks down afterwards. She finds out her wife is an alcoholic. But it's also, so it's about all of that, but it's about, I suppose, what we were talking about earlier. It's in a kind of more sort of, if you take a step back from the book, it's about how we've been told we can have everything. We've been told that we can do everything. We've been told we can freeze our eggs. We've been told we can have a baby at 35, at 40, at 45. We've been told we can marry who we want, do what we want. And then she finds that essentially she can't have all the things that she wants. And so on the front here, it says, I thought I had harnessed the power of my own strength and greed and love in a life that could contain it, but it has exploded. It is a hard read, and it is absolutely electrifying.
Wow. I mean, it's true though. That's tackling lots of topics that we don't talk about, and yet we live. I mean, I can think of, 3 friends instantly who, would get something from this book from their own life experiences. So that's the nice thing about books, in that they're there out in the world to be found, aren't they, for people
Yeah.
who are lost or seeking. And this certainly sounds like, well, like you said, electrifying book. Yeah.
She's very hard on herself. I think reading it again, she's too hard on herself. I think you do get the sense that she's told by a doctor that it was nothing to do with her decision to fly, or that but often, we both had children at, babies at 35, and it was totally fine. She clearly does blame herself for flying on a plane, for going somewhere far away, for having for being an older mother. And you go, okay, no, you are wrong to blame yourself. But the points that she makes, which are not wrong, that we're told always to be afraid of our fertility through our 20s and early 30s, and then suddenly at 35, quick, push the button now, you can pump a baby out, quick. Oh no, it's not this sort of, she talks about it as the dragon, that you train up the dragon, you chain it up, the dragon of your fertility, and then you hit 35, and then everyone shouts, wake up the dragon, but the dragon is old, and the dragon hasn't got the fire it once had. And you think, yes, people aren't necessarily talking about that either. So it's a hard book, but it is horrific, and she's such a good writer.
Wow. Well, that sounds incredible. What's your third pick?
My third pick is going to be, oh gosh, I can't decide between which of the two. I will go for Rachel Cusk.
Oh, that's good.
Rachel Cusk, don't I?
I was excited for you to get to this one, because I absolutely love Rachel Cusk, and this is one of my favourites.
There's a coffee ring on mine. Mine is so worn. It's so sort of full of bits of paper and written on. And it's so Kate Kellaway of The Observer said, as compulsive as a thriller. And Esther Freud says, an incitement to riot. I laughed out loud, often in painful recognition. And I'll read this funny, moving, brutally honest account of her early experiences of motherhood by award-winning novelist Rachel Cusk provoked acclaim and outrage in equal measure. A life's work is an education in baby books, breastfeeding, toddler groups, broken nights, bad advice, and never being alone. And this was published over 20 years ago now. And do you remember when it was published? Did you have
I don't think it was on my radar then, because it just wouldn't be. So I found it, probably 8 years ago. And then I was like, oh yes, of course, yes, that completely resonates for me. But then, of course, I looked into the whole backlash, and I Googled everything that had been said about her at the time, and the backlash that she received for writing it. And well, I'm still amazed by it, really.
Yeah, people went nuts. I think she said she was on Newsnight or something, having to do.
Yeah.
People said, well, she doesn't love her children.
Yeah.
Because she talks about she speaks the truth. She speaks about maternal ambivalence. She speaks about wanting to, trying to, the thing that we were talking about just now, trying to reconcile your old self, the self that moves in the world, the intellectual self, with the new kind of physical, emotional reality of motherhood. And she speaks the truth dazzlingly, and it is uncomfortable, and it is wonderful. It is transporting. She's very funny. When she sort of talks about going to a toddler group for the first time and sitting on the floor and eating biscuits with her daughter and other people and their babies, and how weird it is. And people hated it at the time. They absolutely couldn't cope with the idea that someone might find this strange and uncomfortable and bizarre and alarming, that a new mother would have these emotions. And so, yes, she was accused of not loving her children. I think some of the reviews were pretty savage. There was a huge backlash.
And maybe that's also why we then had this silence for quite a long period afterwards, until yourself and other writers started talking about it again, because it's that same old thing, that if a woman speaks up about something that society finds slightly uncomfortable to hear, the first thing we do is bat her down and silence her, put her back in a box, and let's pretend it didn't happen.
Yeah.
I also remember when I was pregnant, people saying to me, you know, it just changes you forever. You don't come out same person. And I remember thinking, but I quite like my person. I don't want to change completely.
Yeah.
And I think that that's something like this was really refreshing. Like, oh, okay, so you don't have to change completely. And that kind of thing that people say to you is just it's a myth, really.
Yeah. And I remember, so I had this book and I had the next book that I'm going to talk about, which is Making Babies by Anne Enright. And I find it interesting now that those were the two books I was drawn to in my 20s when I wanted to find out what being a mother might be like, because they were both by writers who wrote other things.
Yes.
And that clearly helped me sort of go, okay, well, they can do other stuff as well, and they happen to be writing about babies, so I'm interested in what they have to say. But I hid them on my bookshelf behind other books, lest people find them and think me broody. I mean, I was hiding them from myself. They felt illicit.
Wow.
And again, I think, you know, you wouldn't think that's about a book about grief. I wasn't hiding H's for Hawk on the back of my shelf. That was perfectly allowed to be found folded up by the bath. But so, I mean, yeah, I felt like not only were those women being silenced, I was silenced, you know, having to sneak my curiosity about them, which feels extraordinary now to me, aged 43.
Incredible.
It tells you about what the atmosphere was like when I was in my 20s.
So incredible also that I found them after I was a mother, you found them before, which is really interesting. Would you tell us about then your final book?
Yes. So this is probably the least distressing of the books that I've picked. So I'll end on it. This is Making Babies by Anne Enright, which does have a baby on the front, and yours has a tasteful cartoon.
Yeah.
And so obviously Anne Enright has won the Booker, and she wrote this book. It's a jumbled up book. It's about she has two babies over the course of this book, and it is a sort of it is a version of Rachel Cusk's book. I think Anne Enright clearly had a better time than Rachel Cusk.
Right.
So it is a gentler book, but she still talks about the struggles that she had, and she talks about what it is like to be in labour. And she does it with all the kind of the fine writing of a Booker winning novelist. So like, you know, all these books, I suppose that the thing that unites them is that for me that they both tell the truth, and the writing is so good. It is so precise. It is full of love, but unsentimental, which I think is important to me.
I have to pause and say that's exactly the same applies to your writing as well.
Oh, thank you.
And not only in my reading of your writing, but also in lots of the reviews that I've read. So I think that, yeah, the whole collection, I just need to add that because you probably wouldn't say it about yourself.
Oh, thank you. I mean, I was aware that I was coming into a difficult place because, you know, there have been people who've done this so brilliantly, but a lot of them did it quite a long time ago. And I think a lot of the books that have been out around the time of mine, you know, there are some wonderful books. There's Inferno by Catherine Cho. There's Laura Dockrell's book on having postpartum psychosis. There's there's Clover Stroud being absolutely wonderful. They all have, how to best to put this, they have more interesting stories than I do. Mine is a very normal story of motherhood. I don't have 5 children. I didn't have postpartum psychosis. I didn't have anything very major happen to me, except that I had a child, and that feels to me very major in a way that I want recognized. So yeah, it was trying to find a way to speak about that with honesty and excitement while acknowledging that society thinks this is quite a mundane thing.
Yeah. And so Anne Enright, just to return to that one, obviously you read that, you said, in your 20s.
Yes.
And I assume you reread it after becoming a mother. And so how did that resonate for you in both readings?
So I think the thing, because my experience in Anne rights are fairly different, I would say. I think the thing that resonated most is actually towards the right at the beginning, around the introduction. She talks about that she'd always felt as though there was a glass wall in her life, and there were women and there were mothers, and the
Okay.
mothers were on the other side of the glass wall, and they moved like distantly sighted whales, is the description that she used, and she could
Okay.
see them and she could wave at them, but she wasn't one of them. And then when she got pregnant, she sort of assumed that she would kind of be like an explorer, and she would go to the other side and she would find out about it, and then she would come back and tell us all about it. And what she didn't realize is that she would be hugely changed.
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose what I wanted to do in a way by writing my book is to smash that glass wall. I don't want there to be the women who have had children and the women who haven't.
Mm.
I want us all to be together in this life and in this society, and I want us all to be able to speak with honesty.
Mm. Mm. Well, that's such a wonderful collection. I mean, look at them. They're gorgeous. All of them. And yours, of course, which I have here.
Oh, thank you.
And so I'm just so grateful to you for putting together this curation. And I'm so grateful to you also for putting together a collection that can speak to, on so many levels, to different types of motherhood, or even people that, you know, didn't reach motherhood in the way that they thought they would. So, you know, I'm grateful to you. I know that the readers will be as well. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me and for inviting me to do this, because it's such a privilege and such a pleasure. I'm honestly, I couldn't be more delighted. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay, thanks, Marianne. We'll speak again soon.
Thank you.
Bye.